It's about.
Okay, it is recording? Question mark? Yes. Okay, so whenever you want.
I mean, that's that. This was like 10 minutes, so I don't know very long.
What's up? What's some pizza? Yeah, I have pizza. This is gluten-free and that's just normal.
What pizza?
Good.
You're my new best friend.
Good, good.
Yeah, this one uses around
On Monday, Wednesday, Friday.
Does anyone want the garlic dip?
11.
Just you can have it. Have it all.
I have the same show.
Papa John's.
That's cool.
Papa Murphy's is like the go home and leave, right? Yeah. Oh yeah, I saw you at the hot tub. You're just eating there? You're just eating there?
I was flying on, but then I realized I had to go meet for a minute.
Oh, I see.
What's happening now?
I'm gonna do a presentation.
Oh, she's not here, she's super bad.
I feel like I'm like a teacher here, just sitting. Alone, but all right, all right.
How many classes are in a kind of higher level? Like, so let's do it Thursday. Kind of.
Available shells
I guess it's supposed to be very.
Pizza swap.
All right, guys, get pizza if you didn't get pizza yet. Pizza and brownies and whatever. From me, from Papa John's. Of course. This pizza is sort of related to our topic today about surprise and expectations. There's a reason for everything. Okay, so I can kind of get started with my presentation. My presentation is basically on neurocircuitry and reward prediction error. And we're gonna specifically look at the dopamine molecule. So I chose this specific research paper called Neurocircuitry of Reward Prediction Error by Uchida and Eschel. And I specifically chose this one even though I don't know much about machine learning and the dopamine molecule because I had a prior connection with one of the professors there called Eschel. He's very kind and he's aware of our club. So if you guys have any questions about this presentation, please write them down and send it to me because I want to connect with this professor after your questions. All right, so we're gonna start from the 1990s. In the mid-1990s, the models of learning gained a neurobiological flair when Wolfram Schultz and colleagues demonstrated the remarkable similarity between dopamine neuron firing rates and the reward prediction error signal. They did an experiment on monkeys. So when monkeys received an unexpected reward, dopamine neurons fire a burst of action potentials. If the monkeys learn to expect the reward, the same reward no longer triggers a dopamine response. And finally, if an expected reward is omitted, dopamine neurons pause their firing at the exact moment the reward is expected. And together, these results basically suggest that dopamine neurons signal the difference between the reward an animal expects to receive and the reward it actually receives. And as you can see here, if the reward is greater than expected, dopamine neurons fire, reward is same, there's no response. If reward is less than expected, then the activity is actually suppressed. And so actually, despite 2 decades of research, it still remains unclear how dopamine neurons make this calculation. So the scientists review studies and tackle this problem from a diverse set of perspectives, from anatomy to electrophysiology to computational modeling and behavior. And they found out several patterns emerged, thankfully, from this whole synthesis. And it's that the dopamine neurons calculate reward prediction error rather than passively receiving it from upstream regions. And I'm gonna go into this more in depth in the other slides, but basically it's that the inputs are very complex and the inputs themselves are combined in multiple separate layers, and they're combined and interconnected in a dense network. But regardless of the complexity of the inputs, the dopamine neurons still produce a homogeneous output. So to find out which computation dopamine neurons actually use, the same authors recorded from optogenetically identified dopamine neurons in the lateral BTA region of the brain as mice performed a simple classical conditioning task. Basically, mice received various sizes of water reward. Sometimes these rewards were received unexpectedly, and sometimes they were received with an odor cue. So the scientists would basically give the mice an odor and then give a reward right after. So the mice has an expectation for the water reward. What they found out is that no matter the size of the reward, a given level of expectation caused a consistent decrease in the dopamine responses. And this is quite unusual in the computation in the brain, but it's very consistent with the classical reinforcement learning models. And also, if you see in the first figure in B, this is the usual computation in the brain. It's like you're changing the slope here because that's the division method, but the dopamine neurons fire in a subtractive method, which is, the graphs just shifting up and down. So this analysis was actually done by averaging over all recorded dopamine neurons. And this is just a population of the dopamine neurons. And the important thing to note here is that each dopamine neuron uses the same function on a different scale. And thus that the dopamine neurons provide an ideal broadcast signal, similar enough from neuron to neuron that downstream targets could decode the same information regardless of the subset of dopamine neurons that they contact. It is also clear, however, that dopamine has so much complexity in it. Like a host of recent studies have shown diversity in every aspect of dopamine neurons, from their physiology to their connectivity to their genetic profiles, and even the reward context is something that we need to consider as biologists or computational biologists. And importantly for this review, some dopamine neurons do not faithfully calculate prediction error in the first place. So rather than encoding the difference between the actual and the expected reward, some dopamine neurons encode like the motivational salience, which is the absolute value of the difference between the expected and actual reward. So in that case, those neurons would be more beneficial in marking behavioral factors rather than updating value assignments. All right, so the prior system actually nicely displays how dopamine neurons respond to unexpected or expected reward. However, there is still a bunch of mysteries behind dopamine neurons, like how is reward information transferred from the reward itself to earlier stimuli, and like how does the system learn the precise timing of the reward? So to answer these questions, we kind of look to the temporal difference model, which is called the TD model, and it's part of the reinforcement learning, one of the fundamentals in reinforcement learning. This is something that I've been talking about for weeks, but I honestly don't quite understand it fully. But basically, TD models are very successful in explaining many aspects of dopamine RPEs, the reward prediction errors, and it provides a link between the dopamine reward circuit and machine learning mechanisms. So here is just a zoomed up version of the TD model. What you see here is V of t is basically the value function or the prediction or the associative strength, as they say here. V of t plus 1 is basically a temporally shifted version of V of t. I think in the research paper, they mentioned that V of t plus 1 is inhibitory and V of t is excitatory. And what is happening here is when the odor cue is present, the value function rises because now the animal expects a reward. And when the reward is given, the value function decreases because the animal doesn't know when the reward is going to be present again. So basically, what they also did was they subtracted V of t from V of t plus 1, and they added this graph with the reward graph. The R is the reward graph. And so when you add these together, what happens is these two cancel out here, and you're just left with dopamine. And that is basically the TD model. And what's important to note that is the RPE is generated by taking the derivative of the reward prediction. So this equation right here is basically the derivative of the prediction. And it's kind of confusing, but yeah, also there's a thing called discounting factor, which is supposed to be shown here, but discounting factor is either 0 or 1. And in this case, it was 1, so they didn't write it here. Yeah. It's just temporally shifted. And I think they purposely did that to derive the derivative. It feels like.
So that's not dopamine.
I don't think it's just like the value, it's like the prediction. Yeah, prediction level. Whatever is written there, like value function. I don't think this is actually the dopamine levels, which is also kind of confusing for me as well. But what's important to note is this is basically the derivative of the original prediction. It's basically the level of prediction. V of t is like the level of prediction that you have. Oh, also this TD model can explain the Pavlov's conditioning thing. You know, I think you guys all heard of Pavlov's experiment where you ring a bell and you give some food, and then the dog starts associating the bell sound with the food, and it starts salivating even when the food is not present, when the bell is just ringing. It also the TD model can also work in more complex machine learning systems like computers playing AlphaGo. I think you guys have probably heard of this as well. This is basically available due to the neuronal implementation of prediction error. And in this case, the reinforcement learning model is better than the human. Just one example. Oh, also, there is a problem because in biology, however, in contrast to just the computers, we don't really have specific receptors for the reward. And our systems are not made out of silicon. So reward value is very subjective to humans. So it's very difficult to calculate that. So we need to take this into consideration. So for example, I'm guessing most of you guys really like pizza. And pizza is a reward for you guys, like 1 or 2 slices. But what would happen if I give you more than like 5 slices at once? Would you still consider that pizza as a reward? Yeah. What if I gave you like pizza every single day? You're like, oh, the first slice of pizza, it's so yummy, it's a reward. The second can, you know, I'm kind of full. The third, you know, you're kind of like disgusted by the pizza now if you eat it every single day for every meal, the same thing, right? So reward value is very subjective with humans. So this one is something that you guys can read on your own. I kind of made this presentation in a way so that you guys can also read on your own, but also follow along. I'm not going to go into too much depth about the locations of the dopamine neurons, but basically using retrograde tracers, scientists examined the projections to VTA and found certain inputs. And what's important to note here is basically that certain regions of the brain give inhibitory inputs to the dopamine neuron, and some inputs of the brain give excitatory inputs to the dopamine neuron. And that's like specific regions of the brain that either gives inhibitory or excitatory inputs. But this is not a human anatomy class, so I'm not going to go over those. Likewise, this is just mapping the regions of the brain. This is mapping kind of like what regions of the brain send inhibitory or excitatory inputs to the dopamine neuron. And they basically found out that the striatum part of the region sends predicted value and dopamine neurons return prediction error. They also found out that the dopamine neurons receive inputs in multiple layers. So it's not just an excitatory input or inhibitory input onto one dopamine neuron, it's multiple inputs combining to dopamine neuron. I'm just gonna close the door. Oh yeah, so it's like a combination of multiple inhibitory and excitatory inputs. So that's what makes it also much more complicated. So I guess one might say like that's very inefficient in the biological system if you have multiple layers. But as you can read in the quotes there, it says that even if an entire brain area were removed from the analysis, the remaining inputs could still reconstruct dopamine RPEs due to the multiple layer system. And the same is true even if the weights for each input were totally shuffled. The resulting output still captured aspects of RPE signals. RP is just reward prediction error, shortened. I just didn't want to say. Also, like the multiple layer thing kind of reminded me of like the neural network having multiple layers, but I don't know if they're actually related. Basically, they found out that VTA GABA neurons put prediction in the prediction error system. And this is kind of, again, going into the anatomy a little bit. So I'm not gonna like dive into this. But these are basically the questions that the authors left at the very end of their research papers. And this is something that we could kind of chew on as a group, maybe. But that was pretty much all of my presentation, except I do have one random slide at the end, but in terms of content, that was my presentation. If you guys have questions, like I would suggest, gathering it all together so I can contact the author one day.
Yeah, so you showed like temporal different slide. Do they think that that calculation is for each neuron or for system?
How would you calculate it as a system as a whole? I think they did it for each neuron and then they averaged it.
So each neuron possibly because that it has an expected value. And then I still don't fully understand the temporal shift, but I'm assuming it's not actually a thing that happens, it's just used to calculate something.
Yeah, it's just used to calculate this thing.
So VMT is like the expected, and if you differentiate that, what do you get?
You get basically, so this gray graph is the derivative of this, I'm assuming, which is the prediction. But what they did was they purposely canceled out these two together. Oh, sorry. So you're just left with this dopamine signal, which is the TD model.
So it's saying that dopamine spike.
Yes. Hold on. Ah. Yeah, I also didn't completely understand because they say that V of T was excitatory and V of T plus 1 was inhibitory. So that's something that I can also like ask the authors as well. But it's just important to know that there is like a derivative correlation between those two like equations.
So it's like RPE is like actual minus expected, but that spike like the dopamine spike is the derivative of expectation. I'm just kind of confused how all those work. Like how the dopamine spike is a correlation, but then RPE, how does that happen?
Yeah, I don't. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, human, so temporal difference is. So, human.
Wait. Wait, I'm gonna actually send you a picture. Can I go on your Discord and message myself?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I have a picture. Also, like this presentation, I also want to know how it can correlate to our reinforcement learning like section and actor critic and all that stuff.
Yeah, I'll try.
Nice to get a general overview of like the machine on how TD is applied. Because right now I'm just kind of confused how a temporal difference is even. Why is that necessary? Why do you need it? How can you talk about either?
But are you guys familiar with any of these equations here? Okay, so this is how it was derived. The TD equation was basically derived from this.
Okay, well that's the same that
Really? So basically, you guys all know what TD model is.
Yeah, the
Pretty
question
much.
is like, where's the line? Like, is it, how does a neuron do this? Like, I feel like the original question of like, where are these calculations are coming from? Or at least, I don't know.
So, what is V1? What is that? Is it value of the neuron?
What do you mean V1
What is
or V of T?
Yeah.
V of T, they say it's a prediction.
Someone added? What else do we have to say?
It's the value function, and I don't think it's the rise of dopamine levels. They just describe it as a prediction. Because when you give it an odor, the value function rises because your prediction levels arises for the reward.
So it's like the frequency of the spikes between neurons. Is that what
I don't think, no, V of T doesn't represent the dopamine neurons actually spiking. I think it's just representing the expectation.
the chemical value?
Yeah, I don't really know how they measure this specifically.
Yeah, I guess it's sort of similar to my question.
Like, how do they measure it?
Like each part of the TV model. Because I think that the whole subtraction thing is going through to make sure that this is a biological thing. So this is what they're going for.
Oh,
One thing, the concept of like neurons that pre-fire, it's like the concept that if there is an expected reward of some kind, a neuron is more easily triggered by something that has triggered that reaction before. So I'm thinking maybe it takes less to actually get that neuron going. It's like there's a connection strengthened. That's the only correlation I can tell you can calculate the inbuilt prediction. I'm thinking it's just like it takes less to get it going. Okay.
yeah. So this graph is actually, you're right. This graph is measuring the spike of the neuron firing. Yeah. So this is actually measuring the bursting frequency of the dopamine neurons firing, the action potentials, basically.
standard and subtraction.
Yeah, so they're basically saying, I'm completely new to this concept as well. I'm learning just like you guys, but they say that the division method is usually used in the brain computationally, and subtractive method is not seen very well. But it's just unique to dopamine neurons.
The subtraction method?
Yeah, subtractive method.
Oh.
And so you see here that like other dopamine neurons all use the subtractive method, but it's just scaled differently depending on what dopamine neurons they are.
What is the negative response?
I don't know. It could be the fact that it was inhibited.
I see, so
Yeah.
like, it's.
Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure.
Double spike. Is it spike per second? I can read the next. Yes.
Mm,
Possibly represent negative spikes per second. The period is what that could possibly be. Maybe it's just a traffic. It seems to be data. Yeah.
I'm not sure how it is, but when we're talking about error, like prediction, absolute value, absolute prediction versus truth,
mhm.
is it most like for instance statistics? It's better to like square the error such that either errors are disproportionate.
I have no idea.
Well, I think that also squares the direction of the error. So,
Well, you could just like.
the brain.
The whole point is to
I don't know.
So just so I'm getting this right, can you go back to that like equation, how to have the little plateau graph?
This one?
No, the one that I was talking about earlier, like the U+1. I really want to get that. Yeah, so what this is saying is that there is ignoring units on like the y-axis. In relation to time, there's some prediction. And if you take the derivative of that prediction, like, first off, why did they do that? Like, what does taking the rate of prediction do? Like the rate of prediction.
That's an interesting question.
Because like that's what they do. So
Mhm.
like that derivative, right?
Wasn't the point of this biology possible?
I'm not.
Yeah, I think they're trying to connect it to like reinforcement learning, which I want to learn more about. So
Well, I just don't really understand this graph. That
Mhm.
makes sense. Or this slide. But I feel like understanding it would help a lot because it really connects prediction to the slides. So like,
right, but you understand like what this red graph means, right? When there's an odor cue, the level of prediction rises because they basically train the mice to associate the odor cue with the reward. So the level of prediction rises, but once the reward is given, the prediction lowers down because they don't know when the next reward is going to be, because there's no odor cue or anything like that.
and I get how the ability graph makes sense, right?
Mhm.
Then why do they randomly cancel out that like number cycle?
Again, this is like too mathy for me. Like I don't know what they were thinking
I
about.
know, like, what's the reason? Why is that? Like that's just T, right? Is that R? No, it's not.
Yeah, R is just reward. This is when the reward is given.
So the reward.
Well, it adds.
Yeah, they added these together, and that's this equation right here, which is the derivative.
So if I'm looking at units here, like somehow the derivative of U T, whatever units is a prediction, right?
Mhm.
Has to be dopamine because that's like the conclusion that's drawn there. If you add the derivative to the reward, they have to be the same units, right? And then when you squash them together, it's just dopamine. So
Mhm.
somehow the derivative prediction is dopamine. It's just I just don't. And I don't get that. Like the rates of prediction,
I'm not sure.
the VOT+1 minus V, that gray graph, the light gray graph, is the derivative of VOT at max light.
It's just like on the derivative is it's like sort of like just the difference of two times of well, I don't know. I only know it around. I just kind of bubble it a little. But the middle is just like one side of a point minus the other side of you know, it's just that I was just like a distance, a step or an inch or whatever of one. That's kind of good, but it's just kind of always bounded. It's like an approximation of what it is.
I think what this is saying is that when you get a Q, our expected reward goes up, and then when the reward hits, our expected reward goes up.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But I don't think that the rhythm can take it. Literally, there's just about like seven. Times 50 plus 1 minus the times 50. Prediction levels, which I guess we're saying is like maybe that's
Right.
the people only research.
Like it's not.
Like, I mean, if you consider what the quantities, like, if you just get them arbitrarily close to each other, then that would be good. But in this case, we don't really care about it. It's just close ones. Yeah, it's kind of.
Isn't the point here to have a biologically plausible derivative?
Yeah, I think just like unit of one B or step size is not 6 and also
I'm not sure if this is what you're trying to say, but I think what the derivative is in this is actually just like as t gets arbitrarily, like as the difference between b of t plus 1 and b of t gets arbitrarily small.
Yeah.
That's essentially the derivative, like that's the rate of change of.
It's not actually instantaneous. It's not actually, because
Not yet.
Yeah.
What is this?
But I'm not making it too big. The chances are an approximation of the curve, if the numerical approximation of their arctic numbers is functionally basically the same as the derivative.
That
Just up on here.
Just out of curiosity.
also, the author does say that by summing these two signals, the dopamine neurons would show like a phasic bursting excitation at the reward predicting phase and inhibition at reward emission phase. So there's no reward here, so there's no dopamine firing at this rate, but when there is that reward cue, the dopamine levels rise here. So that's why they summed it together.
What's interesting to me is that it's actually not, the brain isn't sending that you when like the reward is received for value that proper prediction
Mhm.
which is that's right. I think it's when they don't line up. Like it's just interesting, the brain is almost seems to be rewarding the cue and not the
Incentivizing the active.
Yeah, it's all about the level of expectation that you have. It's not even about the amount of reward that you receive.
I just like figure out. So when we talk about dopamine, what I think, so I want to know, is that dopamine is like the happiness. So
Dopamine is not the happiness.
so
It's
it's something else. It's way different than what I know.
dopamine is basically the learning molecule. Yeah, I think that's like the biggest misconception ever. Dopamine is not the happy molecule. It's not like the motivation molecule. It's basically a learning molecule that has to do with expectation and the actual reward. Yeah. So I guess, my question would be, how can we like apply this to whatever the heck we're doing in our club, if we can? Like,
This is very, very. I told them.
you can plug this if you want to.
Oh, you just look up Q learning equation.
Yeah.
Just the study of those. See pretty much the exact same equation. Yeah,
Interesting.
the first one there.
This one?
It's literally what you just described, but in a mathematical form. It's like the goal is to try and predict, but it's just like work.
Basically, essentially the exact same equation.
Uh-huh.
And it's just a little bit.
Uh-huh. So where else is this used in like machine learning?
So this is cue learning, which is a for reinforcement learning. So basically, it's all learning.
They said it's like the fundamental thing in reinforcement learning. Is it?
Yeah. So the thing about cue learning. Learning is usually the best on policy really. And that so it takes the best estimated true value and then you cut that. Whereas in reinforcement learning, like if you imagine humans always did the thing that gives them the best expected true value, that would not be well, so right, I know, we would struggle with this problem too. So that's the classification for there's many variants on Q learning and try to one of them is that Q learning estimates how I don't know.
Wait, so can we use that to the actor predict model that you're talking about?
Absolutely, yeah, that's what we're gonna do tomorrow.
Because I think I need more explanation about the actor predict model.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot. Yeah.
How does active predict relate to the GAN method of like forgery?
Again, that was
GAN has the forger and the predicted meters. Those kind of
so
analogous to it.
wait, so I haven't done much with the game. Right now, where it's like one generates something like classify something, and then another says whether it's right or wrong or something like that.
Yeah.
I think. I don't know, let them talk on it.
Why is it, so if the brain predicts the reward correctly, there's like zero like dopamine action, right? How is the brain incentivized to predict the reward? There's no reward action being reacted.
Well, I don't think like
So if the actual reward, the expected reward are the exact same, they hit your brain with the reward activity. Your brain gets no extra reward for that prediction.
No, it's just zero. There's no action. No activity.
Then we're good.
So you don't know the model.
It's an operation, like, why would it change it? So good.
Because dopamine's learning. It's not learning. But, okay.
So like, see, if the reward is same as expected, there's no response.
There's no need to update.
Yeah, no need to update.
I
Yeah.
see. Okay, that makes sense to me. So this just goes into like the difference, like it's just like
Yeah,
how far off
exactly.
were you from your target, and how
Exactly.
update the model.
Exactly.
my question would be like, I've always wondered where dopamine is in the brain. Does it decay as a model, like as a molecule? Does it get replaced? Where is it synthesized? So how does that get fused to the brain without updating a bunch of things that don't need to update?
That's a good question. I don't actually, yeah, I can write that down.
It's like either. But my understanding, at least this is the next one. It potentially be up. So then it goes into the synaptic factor, and at some point it has to update, you have to update it again, and most molecules. Decay over time. So, I don't know that it's so, no.
But what the paper is also saying is that depending on the region of those dopamine neurons, it can function differently.
Are different neurons, like, and then adding on to that question, different neurons, like, since like more, if it is on a per neuron basis.
know, they're basically saying that it really depends on the location of the brain. There's so much complexity within just one dopamine neuron, and like that's
Then, so if activity, or like if the reward is less than expected, it says that.
the activity is actually suppressed.
suppressed.
Yeah,
How does that happen?
I don't know how. I think that's a good question to ask as well.
Yeah,
Like you're not giving them the reward. So I wonder if that's actually representing the subtractive, like the -0, that like negative function, right?
suppression, maybe.
Yeah, it could be.
But
'Cause
that
you were
would
like, how do you
imply
have-
relative to a baseline amount of spikes rather than just absolute.
Right.
You can't have- Even if you're suppressing, that's not. Unless. You polarize, super polarized. Okay, Charles, about your question, thought about it, and I don't think I can come up with a very good answer that is sufficient, but I can say that like reinforcement learning, it's a similar concept. But in reinforcement learning, you're going to take an action in an environment, whereas in a GAN, you're just going to make something. But I think there are more differences in that. I just don't have. My journal club next week is going to be on, I think it's predict, like, it's very similar to this, like prediction in the brain, but also like how it's encoded through like what we're talking about, where some neurons are like predisposed to spike. Maybe I could do something about reinforcement learning as well. I don't know what.
Is this really like learning?
This is a different form of learning in the brain. So yeah, heavy learning is one method, but this is dopamine and like that's different. Do you know how dopamine? So if dopamine like is increased, what happens then? Is that like increase the
baseline?
no, increase the probability that those neurons will fire again, or how does that work? Or the neurons that cause events?
I don't know if it increases the probability of that dopamine neurons firing, but I learned from Huberman that actually like the constant increase in dopamine is actually a bad thing because it can make you like too used to that and you won't be able to feel pleasure as much.
Right, sure. I'm just wondering like. So what actually happens when you start? Right, and a cell receive like another neuron receives that, what happens, what changes?
Yeah,
It's
like I just have this more.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Servers that are used for CS classes.
Oh.
It's like standardized. But it's not. I just installed the shell. Yeah, I should have done this back then. It's literally still commands, set it up. They might not like that. I usually.
Yeah, like interesting. I used it on.
No, that's like
You actually did.
sick in the head.
I don't hate it, it's just like, I'm learning.
It's like definitely. You should set up so it's like this. As far as.
But yeah, my neuro class so far, we didn't go into any of the neurotransmitters or dopamine molecules.
What are you guys doing?
Right now, we're doing anatomy, just regions of the brain, absolutely no intuition, or we're not even going deeply about the function of the brain, but just labeling all the anatomy and the arteries. We're having a quiz on that this Friday. Yeah.
Yeah.
You can see that.
You just put that secret.
Wait, Varun, what is that thing? Tablet.
Oh,
It's like a paper, like, wait, what is it?
it's like basically, it's just like, here, take a pencil, right? It's pretty cool.
The other thing is you just put it
Keep
like
it focused.
just put some lines. Oh, that's cool.
I know. What even is this like connected to the internet?
Like ruin.
It's okay.
Is this connected to the
It's not
internet?
remarkable. It's like, I saw it on the Instagram ad and like asked my mom for it.
Oh my
For like a
gosh.
college, like going up to college, and she's like, yeah, why not? I mean, most kids that like iPads, you know, like,
Uh-huh.
or surfaces, right? And I just thought like, I already have a laptop, I don't want to get another iPad as well, so I just have this instead.
This is just instead of a notebook, right?
Yeah, basically, it's just like, I have all my classes on here, I can archive them.
Oh, also, you guys should get more food. There's more brownies here.
I think it's around everyone.
Yeah.
Like, there's no highlight.
Sweet. Do you wanna end this now or?
Yeah, yeah, we can have it.